Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back to 7 o'clock in the morning after a very long night of watching the Eagles play really bad football. Now, anyway, getting into it, though, we're going to pick right up where we left off in class. You did a great job yesterday. We covered a lot of content, and we actually spent most of our day covering the Spartans, right? So we talked about the Spartans and their growth during the Archaic period, right? We got into women in Sparta, how they actually had much more rights than many other, like women in other city-states all over Greece. We talked about military training and Spartan society and like women were allowed to marry and like their government and stuff like that. Always important to remember that they had 2 kings and a little bit of a baby democracy, even though it was kind of just a bunch of people shouting and freaking out. Now, the interesting thing, though, is getting into it, is the last thing we'll say about Sparta is that they actually are going to basically isolate themselves economically away from the rest of Greece, right? Now, again, remember, it is important to know that there were tons of other city-states in ancient Greece. There's Megara and Corinth and Delphi, and there is Athens, and then there are Greek colonies everywhere, like Ionia and Syracuse, right? There are all these different places that actually exist that are of Greek influence, right? And Sparta is going to isolate themselves away from all of them, right? They're like, we take over people when we need. We take those people as helots. They are our slaves that do all of our work to allow our men time to become very, very, very militarily strong. And then going into it, citizens were also even not allowed to travel, and they were actually discouraged from trading almost completely. Sparta would trade when necessary, usually just to get key items or things that they desperately needed, and this made them very, very unique and very, very deadly. And we'll actually see a lot of this stuff come to fruition when we talk about like Philip II, who was the father of Alexander the Great, and his approach to the Spartans, etc., 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 right? So let me put it on my stopwatch. There we go. But a big thing also is, now we're going to be getting into Athens, right? We're going to be talking about the boring ones. No, they're not boring. They actually are pretty interesting. It's very, very interesting how they're so well known for one key thing, right? They're very well known for this essence in this title, Athens, ruled by the people, right? So the big thing that Athens is known for is their democracy, right? Their democracy and the growth of their culture during what is known as the classical period, okay? So, and we will get very, very in-depth with that stuff in later flips and like go over all that and talk about those things. But a really important thing to kind of take note and understand is definitely like jot this down on here, that democracy idea, or like underneath ruled by the people, just put democracy. We have to understand that there's also a lot to Athens that a lot of people don't traditionally teach, but I do, because I think it's important for you to understand them and know them, and it leads to their eventual downfall. Now, this right here is what's left of the Acropolis of Athens, right? So remember, we have the lower city and the Acropolis right there, 2 of the main parts of the Greek city-state, and that is the all-famous building, the Parthenon, that is actually built on the Acropolis of Athens, right? Now, big thing with the Athenians, they were claimed to have been started and colonized by these people called the Ionians, right? Now, interesting little fact, though, Ionia was already a city over in Turkey, and also another little bit of a weird thing is that the Ionians not necessarily would have existed during this time period, and Athens also outgrew the Ionians by this point in history. So more than likely, the Athenians, just like the Spartans, were settled by the Dorians. But claiming who you're settled by is a very, very interesting component because it kind of gives us credence into the entire growth of Athens and their belief that they are separate or different or inherently better than everybody that is actually existing in history of the area. Current day Athenians are very nice people. But like I'm talking about ancient Athenians, archaic Athenians, right? So that also the thing about it is they were so well known for their democracy. They're so well known for this concept of like we have voting and it's fair and it's equal and it's this and it's that. But they didn't start out that way. What Athens actually started out as was a very, very large chunk of land where wealth grew very, very fast, right? So they started out as what is known as an aristocracy. In the original Athenian settlement, anybody who had power, wealth, and like goods was able to actually be in charge. And they usually ruled over their individual land holdings and the people that lived on them, right? So basically what it would be is there would be a wealthy person in Athens and they would own a parcel of land, right? They would then contract that land out to other people, like actually poorer people that were laborers and farmers, right? And so basically you were ruled directly by the person that owned the land that you were on. This is very important to remember because when we get into the Middle Ages, the feudal system is going to pop up and it's almost the exact same, right? But as time progressed, then the wealthiest of those wealthy people then came to power, and they had a oligarchy, right? So basically they had a small council, non-elected, agreed upon by the wealthy, that was in charge of Athens, and that's known as an oligarchy, right? So they basically evolved from rich people in charge to a smaller group of rich people in charge. And wealth with this is going to grow very, very quickly because the Athenians begin to grow grapes and olives, and their farming techniques begin to advance, and they start growing a lot of wealth very fast. And as their boundaries grew, they pulled in other smaller Greek settlements to form one really large city-state. Now, the problem here is that you're being ruled over by people that do not understand the needs of the laborers that work on their land, right? So this brought up a huge issue, and it particularly brought up an issue because problems are going to arise, right? And government reform is going to be demanded. So problems are going to show up, particularly in the fact that Athens grew way too large, way too fast. It started struggling to feed itself. And the poor are beginning to become very, very furious, right? The people that work on these lands and grow these crops to keep everyone alive are starting to get very, very upset because even as they grow them, food goes to the landowners first, and then it eventually trickles down into whoever else gets like any kind of leftovers. So they were struggling to feed themselves, and they were struggling to have any kind of infrastructure because under the oligarchical reign, they were not actually addressing the problems that were rising up in these poorer communities or for these poor people. And then on top of that, they basically were turning their laborers into slaves, right? So something that's important to take note of is that debt slavery popped up very, very heavily in ancient Athens, right? So one, these poor people are basically starving and don't have enough food. And two, they're not actually being given any food by the people that own the land that they live on. And three, their voices are not being heard. And then four, they're going into debt and having to perform at a certain amount, and they're not allowed to leave the land without they're paying that debt off. So what ended up happening is debt slavery showed up, which is the concept of every time the poor that worked on the lands for the oligarchical groups and the aristocracy of Athens before their democracy, they had to beg the landowners for food, supplies, and all these other things. And so what the landowners would do is say, that's fine, I'll give you these things, but now you're in debt to me, with the intention of never allowing them to get out of debt. And so they said to them, you cannot leave my land and you cannot stop working for me or your family until this debt is paid off. And they actually kept track of their debt with this thing. It's called a Horos, right? They would actually sit a big block of like rock next to the huts of Athenians, poor Athenians and working Athenians. They would sit this next to their huts or their homes and carve into them everything that they owed the landowner, right? And so basically the Horos became the image of debt slavery, and all of these like poorer people in Athens are being completely taken advantage of. And then the aristocrats started fighting for power with one another, and they started trying to become tyrants, right? So what ends up going down is these aristocrats, part of this oligarchy, start forming armies and forming small militaries and then fighting with one another with the hopes of becoming what is known as a tyrant. Tyrants are people who are elected during times of crisis that have complete control. So what these leaders of Athens are trying to do is basically become the first kings of Athens. To become the kings of Athens by raising a large army and actually attacking their competitors that also have something that actually could rival their abilities. So this honestly is almost exactly like the growth of medieval Europe. And it's like very, 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 very important that we remember that, right? And so as these aristocrats started going to war with each other, finally, some people are going to show up, right? And Athens started forming this oligarchical group of leaders known as Archons, right? So there were Archons of Athens. There were 9 of them, right? And so Solon would eventually become elected as one of them. So as the aristocrats start fighting with each other, their democracy begins to grow, because they had to figure out ways for the wealthy people to vote and decide on who they wanted to be in charge, hence that oligarchy, right? So kind of like Sparta, they would actually have an informal voting process, and they would elect these people known as Archons. And the Archons of Athens were supposed to meet together. There were 9 of them, an odd number, so they always had to come to an agreement, or actually so somebody could get outvoted. These Archons would meet together and figure out these problems. Well, when one of them was elected, his name was Solon, he becomes Archon in 594 BC, and he is considered the father of modern-day government. When he comes to power, he works to convincingly show the rest of the Athenians that debt, slavery, and the Horos are disgusting, and he outlaws both of them. And he has all of the Horoses like destroyed and like actually put away, and saying like you cannot enslave someone via debt to your land anymore. He pushed Athens towards a democracy, and also even brought in the concepts of allowing poorer workers to vote themselves and actually grow a true democratic system where everyone votes on the Archons of Athens rather than just like a handful of wealthy people who actually own land. Now, he also made leadership based more on wealth rather than lineage. This allowed for the possibility of poorer individuals to work their way up and possibly actually one day rule over small parcels of land, and then also become an active member of the Athenian democracy. So Solon's very, very important. And what ends up going down in this sense is that Solon and several other great leaders show up. So you got to understand that like his reforms weren't realized like immediately. They actually went through a lot of different variants. For example, when Solon came to power, he told all of the aristocrats of Athens to stop farming a lot of different stuff, which was leading to the famines that were happening in Athens, right? Because basically what was going on is the aristocrats were farming like wheats and barleys and grains and peas and this and that. And so what Solon does is he comes in, he's like, no. No one's farming all that stuff anymore. We're all farming olives. Everybody farm olives. We're going to make olive oil, and we'll trade for the goods that we need, right? So Solon was a fantastic leader and pushed the reforms, and that actually eventually led to Athenian democracy. But he was then followed by a couple of really bad leaders as well. Now, see, he was followed by several bad leaders that kind of wanted to go back to the oligarchy, wanted to put things in reverse, and the other Archons had feuds with them. And a few different rebellions pop up until Solon's forms are finally realized under this guy named Cleisthenes, right? And so under Cleisthenes, the Athenian democracy truly takes shape, the idea that Solon basically was creating, right? And so in this concept, under Cleisthenes, everyone in Athens, as long as you weren't a woman, were allowed to vote, right? So they actually allow anyone who owns a slight bit of property or free men to actually vote in the Athenian democracy. And because of those terrible rulers that followed after Solon, they decided on this concept as well of ostracism, right? So basically, the Athenians, and one of the key parts of their democracy is two things. One, how they voted, right? So the way most Athenians voted for leaders is they would all arrive at a place together. They would actually ask, like, do you want to vote for this person? And people would raise their hands, right? Like, you would actually raise your hand in front of everybody, and they would count hands and move people to the side and figure out how many people voted for individuals as the process of the growing the Archon of Athens actually worked. And then also in Athens, whenever they would vote yes or no on something, let's say, for example, the 9 Archons of Athens proposed an idea, a law that would say, oh, okay, we're going to outlaw the sale of tacos on Tuesdays, right? They would actually, like, you would go in to vote yes or no on that under Cleisthenes, and there would be a pile of black rocks and then a pile of white rocks. And the black rocks were no, and the white rocks were yes. And if you agreed with it, you picked up a white one. If you didn't, you picked up a black one, and you put it into a pot, and they broke it open, and they counted everything up. So this is a very efficient system of voting. But remember, some bad leaders followed after Solon, right? So how do you prevent a bad leader? We, in our government, have adopted impeachment. The Athenians adopted ostracism. And what ostracism was, is the other Archons of Athens could appear and say, we would like to see if y'all would like to vote to ostracize, who are we going to ostracize? All right, so to ostracize Abby Ragusa, right? Abby Ragusa is a terrible Archon, and she's leading to people's debt slavery and all this other stuff. So would we like to ostracize Abby Ragusa? If you would like to ostracize Abby Ragusa, we will actually vote on this tomorrow in class. But what would end up happening is Abby has to actually get ostracized and kicked out of Athens for like 10 years to allow time for the Athenian community to like heal, which is a very, very important concept that actually plays into the Athenian democracy, right? Athens was divided into several series of tribes, kind of like regional states, to make the rulership of those different areas more efficient. And this new government, though, how do you think Sparta's going to feel about it? They hate it. Now, so Spartans believed that this style of government was only going to lead to negative outcomes for them, because the entire Spartan society was based completely in military tradition, surviving wars, and showing your grit and fortitude as a man through survival and also wise wisdom and growing your influence, right? Whereas in like rank and privilege and concepts like that. Whereas the Athenians were starting to create a concept where anybody can do certain things and everybody's supposed to be like equal to a certain extent, which bothered the Spartans a lot as well because like they have an entire society that's dependent on slave labor, right? So the big thing though going forward though also is something you need to know. Speaking of Spartans though, their women way more rights than the Athenian women had. So Athenian women could not do anything by comparison to a Spartan woman. They couldn't participate in politics. They couldn't leave their house without the permission of a man. When they did leave, they usually had to cover their hair. Women were essential for religious rituals, but that's the only time you ever saw them in public, which is really, really screwed up when you think about it because Athens is named after the goddess Athena, and you would think that if you have an entire city-state named after a goddess, a female patron, that you would actually, like, be nicer to women, but they weren't. So, and then women also had much more freedom in Sparta. And this right here is an example of like kind of like the rejection of Sparta or of Athenian women rights is that this right here was one of the only places that they were allowed to go to on their own. It's the communal well. They were only allowed to go to the place where they could actually collect water every day by themselves without anybody's actual like permission. And it actually became a very big gathering spot for Athenian women where they would actually come together and actually like share time with one another. And so they weren't just completely stuck inside the entire day, right? Now, education also serves as a big thing as well because Athens adopts an education system rather than a military training system like Sparta, right? And so as you can see right here on this red figure plate, this is actually supposed to be the idea of showing you what Athenian school would have looked like, right? So Athenian school, of course, had your traditional teacher figure, and like also, as you can see, though, on the sides of them, the students were all male, right? And so the young male students that were wealthy, that could afford to go to school, learned a lot of different subjects, including music. For example, this thing right here is a lap lyre that's sitting on his lap, and poetry, public speaking, and a lot of other different things. Boys attended school if they could afford it, and they learned to read, write, music, poetry, and public speaking. Now, why do you think public speaking was a big subject taught in ancient Athens? Oh, that's exactly right, Damari. It's a big subject taught due to the fact that they were actually basically training themselves to be government workers and government officials later on, to participate in this democratic system, to possibly be able to run for office or run to be an archon, right? And so they received some but very little military training, right? Military training was usually done by the Athenians when they needed it or in times of crisis, and they usually always had a standing army ready to go at any one given time. But now, funny enough, though, their standing army was much smaller than Sparta's, and later on, we're going to actually talk about how the Athenians basically create a different part of their military that becomes their kind of hang your hat on it, this is what we do kind of thing. Now, speaking of hang your hat on it, this is what we do kind of thing, the big thing you need to understand also is that during this entire time period, Athens and Sparta were growing, right? So, like, we now understand both of them very well. We know Athens had a very intense democratic reform that led to the adoption of their entire government, right? We know that Spartans were based completely in military tradition. But even though they were so different, they both were still growing all the same. And they were creating these colonies all over the place, right? So these right here are all the colonies of ancient Greece put together. Sparta's, Corinth, Megaris, Delphi's, like Syracuse, Athenian colonies, all of them put together. So everything in red was controlled by someone who was descendant of an ancient Greek, right? Now, this, on the other hand, is how much is controlled by the ancient Persians, right? Yeah, the Persians, the people we talked about in the very last unit, are now finally coming back, right? The Persians controlled the massive empire to the east, and if you look at the two of these people about to fight each other, little red guy versus giant orange guy, it seems like the Persians have a giant advantage when it comes to actually winning any type of wars or engagements that could possibly break out, right? And what's going to end up happening is the Persian Wars are going to occur between the Persians and the Greeks, right? Now, important thing to note and understand, though, is that, one, you can call them the Persian Wars. That's fine. I don't. All right. So, like, as a historian, I think that you calling them the Persian Wars is completely okay, but it's a very loaded statement, right? Most times the Persian Wars are referred to as wars to try and lump together three massive conflicts that occurred from about 500 BC to about, give or take, 450 BC, right? Now, looking at this entire thing, though, you also got to understand that the Persian Wars weren't really kind of wars in the common day sense. No one sent a treaty and said, hey, when we win, we're going to do this, except in the third one. So out of all the wars, only the third one could really be called a war. But let's look at it this way. Write this down. The Persian Wars were actually one revolt and two invasions, right? One revolt in the first one, and the last two Persian Wars were invasions of the Greek mainland by the Persians directly, right? Now, the big overview and understanding, though, is that despite their cultural ties, the Greek city-states were often in conflict with one another, and the threat of the powerful Persian Empire is going to cause them to unite together. That's right, we're talking about Sparta and Athens are going to have to work together to destroy this giant threat, or else both be destroyed, right? So the entire thing ends up breaking out, though, over a silly little revolt. So as the Persians were growing, and they actually ended up taking over this small place called Ionia in 546 BC, they gobbled it up and brought it into their empire. They conquered the Greek colonies in Ionia, and the response of the Ionians out of nowhere, and who was ruling over Persia at this time, but Darius the First, right? Darius the First took over Ionia and was like, hey, guys, you get to keep your traditions and your customs and your language and your religion and all that other fun stuff. You can have at it. We won't take it. Just pay your taxes. But the Ionians, being Greek, were like, no, and just like freaked out and refused to pay tribute, burned their fields, and began to rebel against the Persians for no other reason other than the fact that they were not Greek, right? So, like, as we can see, there's some Greek arrogance going on here. Even though the Greeks had actually taken over, even though the Persians had actually taken over other Greeks by this point, one really big, powerful area known as Lydia, who can trace its origins back to Greeks as well, which actually they came up with the concept of coining money first, and the Persians discovered it from them. They were, like, fine being under Persian rule, but the Ionians were not. And during this whole process, though, guess who is secretly sending weapons? Athens. Athens was sending weapons and ships to the Ionians, hoping that it would aid their rebellion against the Persians. The Athenians thinking to themselves, if the Ionians are successful, they'll basically create a wall between Persia and us in the terms of a colony barrier buffer zone, right? But that right there is where we're going to end with this flip. I will see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.